So welcome to the first invited talk of ICAPS 2015. Speaker is Joerg Hoffmann. He's hiding in the wings here. I don't know how much I need to introduce Joerg. Everyone knows Joerg. You know, he's the inventor of FF, the winner of the first really big planning competition, the first one that had an actual winner. Sorry, I'm not close enough to the mic. He's done enormous amounts of very good, very well-known work in developing heuristic search planners, in understanding and analyzing heuristic search planners, etc. But he's also done quite a bit of work on applications of planning, and for example, spending a year, I think it was, at SAP, and finding that he didn't even need to teach them how to speak PDDL because they already do. So now he will be talking about simulated penetration testing, which is apparently not just an application of planning, but of AI in general. So welcome, Joerg.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak here today. And before I get into what this is about, I would like to clarify a few things just to make sure you don't have wrong expectations, so you know what to expect from this talk. First off, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to sing a song today. Okay, if I can think about a song on network testing, I'll let you know. I'm not going to be talking about all those heuristic search things I've been working on for so long, as Patrick already pointed out. That would have been a very easy and safe choice, right? But perhaps a bit boring because many of you are already familiar with this, so I decided to do something much more adventurous. Okay, so I'll be talking about something that most of you are not aware of. One consequence of that is that, whereas usually talks, and in particular invited talks, come with solutions, I don't. Okay, I come with a problem. And this problem actually looks a bit too benign. Our problem looks somewhat like that. Okay, so the task is to turn this into a race car that actually wins international championships. And, well, I can deal with some of the parts, but I need fellow mechanics to deal with the other parts. Okay. So essentially, I'm not saying this is this great topic on which I wrote 100 papers. I'm saying this is this great topic on which you can write 100 papers. So it's a feature, not a bug, right? Having got that out of the way, the second thing I would like to say is, what is my aim for today? So I don't know about you, but the things I remember from long ago invited talks are fairly rudimentary. So in your rudimentary long-term memory, I would like you to remember this. Okay. I'm going to show you some table. It's going to look a bit like the American flag with the colors inverted. And the part in the top left corner is going to be interesting. And there's actually a paper in the Proceedings, so as long as you remember that there was something like this, and you could do some interesting stuff perhaps in the top left corner, you can always go back to the Proceedings to remind yourself of what it actually meant. To drive this even deeper into your long-term memory, I have this little illustration here. So it's going to be a systematization of model classes. In the bottom right corner, that's going to be the only model we've seen at ICAPS so far. In the top left corner, you can do some interesting sightseeing. Okay. There's not a nice illustration. It's actually almost geographically correct, provided you hold your tourist map upside down. Okay. So if it's a Hebrew map, I guess you can manage, right? Good. So now for the actual talk, what is this all about? Let me just get straight into that. Well, the context is network hacking. That's pretty simple. You got a network and a hacker, as you see on this slide. The hacker is going to try to exploit software vulnerabilities in order to gain access rights and make his way through the network until a sensitive part. Okay. So that's what hackers do. I mean, obviously, I'm the AI guy here. I'm not into this domain, but let's say you're a company who wants to protect their network from outside hackers getting into the sensitive part of the network. That's what this is about. How do we do such protection? Well, one well-established method is so-called penetration testing. You might be aware of that. I'm not sure. It's a very old and venerable method. It was established basically when computers first got networked. The idea is you hire somebody who attacks your network. Then when they find a security issue, you know exactly what you can close. By comparison, there's something called vulnerability scanners, which is like the most well-known computer support for this kind of thing. What they do is they give you a big, big list of known software vulnerabilities that might be applicable to one machine. Now, if you're the security team at eBay, you got like thousands of machines, and the list you're going to get is going to be megabytes long, and it's just impossible to process this. By contrast, if you do a pen test, you know exactly where the issue is, and you can close it. This is an established industry in the market, so there are several companies. One of them I've been working with, Core Security. They're based in Boston and Buenos Aires. The tool is called Core Impact. You should think about this tool in terms of some kind of framework that allows human pen testers to apply their attacks conveniently. Like you don't have to do everything by hand in a shell script. You just have an environment that allows you to run standard exploits in a convenient manner. What makes this interesting for us is that Core Security has also started to look into automation since a couple of years, and they're actually using Mimetic FF Planner to do that. So this is part of the reason why I'm here now. I mean, this is from where all this developed. But first, having said the word automation, why is it actually relevant? Why is the company interested in that? Well, first of all, I mean, so they're a company who sell their tools to other companies who actually run the networks. Think eBay. Okay. Now, does eBay want to spend a huge part of money on their security team and have a really big security team so they can really be sure their network is secure? Well, no. I'm being told that companies usually don't like to spend a lot of money on security because for them it's not part of their business model. I mean, it's a money sink. You know, they don't actually get revenue from that. It's something they have to spend money on. They're reluctant to spend a lot of money. Nevertheless, those networks are huge, right? You got an incredible amount of things you need to test, so you want the test to be fast, so you can have high coverage. You can actually look at your network in a comprehensive manner. So it's very important for this to be fast. Obviously, automation can help with that. Now, here's the, I think, most impressive part of the motivation. And I really only noticed that when preparing those slides, and I made a simple Google for exploits database, and those are public. They're like public databases of exploits that are known, like known software bugs that you can exploit as an attacker, if you will. You might have already seen it, so here's the relevant part of this information. We're on page 234 of this list. Okay. And I'm only screenshotting the top part of the list. Each single page is about 5 times as long as what I'm showing here. So if you imagine you are the security officer and you have to wade through those lists on a network of 10,000 machines at eBay, you can imagine what a hell of a job that is. It also changes every week, like all the time somebody invents new exploits and somebody else invents new defenses. It's a very dynamic thing, as you all know. I mean, Windows asks you to update this all the time. So the ultimate vision is, instead of doing this manually, we'll make a model of the network and its potential vulnerabilities, and we'll run some planning, decision-making process from the point of view of the attacker to actually simulate what the attacker might do, and therefore to automate the pen testing. And ideally, because this is model-based, you know, we decouple the solver from the model. When some new exploits come along, all you need to do is to add them into the model and then go drink a coffee. It's of course not going to be quite that easy, but there's a clear business case, right? Now, what is the problem with the business case? Well, you all know the Turing Test. Just to explain the figure, the human on the left-hand side is not supposed to be able to distinguish between the human and the computer talking to him. What's that to do with security? Well, here's what I like to posit the ultimate vision for this application. Okay, it's like the Turing Test, but with hacking instead of talking. So on the left-hand side now you got a network, and it's supposed to not be able to distinguish between being attacked by a human hacker or a simulated hacker. Now you are probably thinking, well, is this really so difficult? I mean, hacking is more technical than human conversation, and so it's likely that we'll be able more easily to put it into a computer. And yes, absolutely, and for the rest of the talk, that's the assumption we're going to be making. However, if you span this like completely broadly, like the ultimate vision, it is actually much, okay, sorry, I lost my track here a little bit. First off, this here is not something of my invention, right? I mean, you might think I'm the AI guy, I'm making this up so that I have something to write papers on. This is actually what the company told me. Okay. So as a rule, networks can be hacked. The question is, how will the actual human attacker out there hack them? So what they told me is ultimately what they want is a realistic model of a human hacker. So it's really something that the business wants, not me as an AI researcher. Now, why is it more general than just technical? Well, there's this big buzzword of social-technical attacks. I don't know if you heard about it already, like phishing emails, and there's actually something called spear phishing, where people first go into Facebook, spy on you, and they write you an email that's very targeted to your particular interests. So if you wanted to simulate this in the computer, then the thought arises of actually sending a Turing Test chatbot into Facebook to spy on people. Now, if you think this is really far-fetched, I'm making this up, there's actually already a paper about it. Now, this is really sort of ethically questionable. I'm not going into this at all. I'm just saying, like, you know, globally viewed, this is actually an AI-complete problem. What will we be doing? Well, we look at this AI-complete problem from a technical point of view. Basically just taking the core security model as it stands and extending it to more interesting, accurate models. and framing this in known sequential decision-making frameworks, because right now I just want to check, okay, how does this fit the things we have, rather than inventing new things. I'm going to start this with the classical planning model. That's the one they actually use in production, like commercially. That's a very simple model. I'm going to briefly explain that. Then I'll make a brief detour into what is called attack graphs. This is not from the AI community, but from a security community research. And I'll make clear at the point in time where that is relevant. Then the main job for today really is to systematize the model space. So what are the relevant distinctions in its applications? What are possible richer, more accurate models? I'm going to start with a POMDP model that I actually created together with the company, like Carlos Zarrautes from the Core Security Research and Olivier Buffet from INRIA. So our aim at this point in time was to make the most accurate possible model of the domain. And that's actually a POMDP, as far as we can model the existing models. Of course, the POMDP has complexity issues, so I'm going to propose a new MDP middle ground model between the POMDPs and the classical planning. At the end, I'm going to systemize that and draw some conclusions and show up some interesting research challenges. Okay, the system architecture is really very simple. The left box here is just the usual core impact pen testing framework, the manual pen testing framework. It has exploits, databases, and so forth. They implemented a very simple export of PDDL, and that is like really classical planning PDDL as used in the competition. Okay, absolutely nothing fancy about it. Then they call an off-the-shelf planner, generate a plan, and that's an attack, and you can actually execute it against the network. And they actually have this facility to execute it against the network. Now, 2 remarks here. A, the model is very abstract, and there's no guarantee whatsoever that the plan will actually work. I mean, simply because it doesn't reflect the reality of the network, and it would be impossible in the classical planning model, and in any model, really. B, customers, I'm being told, are kind of excited about the possibility to do that, but they're actually scared of doing it. I mean, nobody wants some automatic computer to attack their network all the time, right? So what they actually use it for is pointing out to the security team where to look, like where the problems may lie. To illustrate that, the haystack you got at, say, eBay is really a fucking huge haystack. Sorry, the language, excuse my French. Now, what the tool is going to do is point you somewhere, and then maybe, if you're lucky, actually the needle is there. Now, of course, this means that accuracy is a core asset, right? Because if your tool points in the haystack where there's actually no needle, then you're just wasting our time. So accuracy is a very important thing. Given that, it's somewhat surprising they can actually use a classical planning model in production. But that's what they do, and I'm going to explain it in what follows. Obviously, I'm not going to read this definition, just so we're on the same page. It's strips. This is just a Statespace, a transition system. I'm just introducing this notation for forward reference to the POMDP and MDP models I'll introduce later on. But this is sort of just to give it a basic notation. Here's the model. I'm just going to show you some PDDL-like snippets. Okay, this is not the actual model in production. Of course, I can't show you that, but it's very similar to this. This is slightly simplified. The most complicated thing in the model is really the action schema names. Those are like the names of the exploits, like some piece of software, there's a possible buffer overflow that you can exploit. This here are aspects that are shared across all action schemas. Like you always start from a source host S, and you want to get to a target host T. You have already compromised S, you want to compromise T, and the two have an IP connection so that when you're starting from S, you can actually connect to T. Okay, so this is the simple part. This is shared by everything. We are always just trying to get from one machine to the next. This here is the part that changes across schemas. Okay, those hash predicates but just basically state the software configuration of each host in the network. Okay, it states the operating system, the particular software installed, the particular service packs, and so forth. Anything that is relevant to the exploits that you want to be executing. Okay, and that is what changes across schemas. So this is what characterizes the exploit, the condition under which you can actually use it. This thing down here is call time, but it's actually a black hole into which they throw everything they can say in the surface level PDDL model. So it does have statistics on the execution time. It has a couple of other things, including something that's very important, success statistics. So in their labs, they always run known exploits against some machines, and then they just collect statistics about how often it works as a function of the observable configuration parameters of the machine. And that gives you a very useful statistic on how likely the exploit is to work. Now, what they do with this here, I mean, it's obviously a probability, right? Instead, they use it as an action cost. So this is a dirty hack, right? We'll get to more cleaner solutions later on. They already explored those in their work, so they're also aware that actually for accuracy they need to use probabilities, and that's of course part of the motivation why I'm doing it here. But what they did so far is very preliminary and really a very dirty hack in itself. So basically I'm just proposing a systematic ways how it should be done. Anyway, I'll get to that later. The initial state and goal, I'm not going to say anything about it, it's exactly what you would expect. Just to get the terminology straight, when I say network graph, what I mean is the graph whose nodes are the machines, like the hosts, and whose edges are the IP connections between the machines. When I say host configuration, I mean the software installed on any one host, and our goal is going to be target host, goal host, meaning that this is where I don't want the attacker to get to. Okay, this is where the attacker shouldn't be able to get to. Okay, of course we have seen something of this kind already, right? Security testing has been around for ages, like Mark Boddy introduced it in 2005. You've seen it in 2 competitions. Really, basically, core security invented this basic idea, reinvented it without knowing about it 5 years later. Their domain is different in scope. I mean, here we're really talking about very detailed IT-level software vulnerabilities, whereas Mark's domain is sort of more high-level and it's about insider attacks. In any case, like I said, what makes this interesting is that the industry is actually using it. Now, I'm the AI guy, right? So what they don't need to tell me about the business, they don't tell me. One thing they did tell me is an example. I'm going to anonymize the city. So there's the city somewhere where if you connect it to the Wi-Fi at the international airport, you could actually hack your way through the administration system to compromise the water supply system. Okay. And this is what this kind of technique is good for. So all of the vulnerabilities exploited were known. In principle, we knew all of that. Just it's so much information that it's impossible to process for a human. So the computer just points, okay, look, by this path here, actually you can do something bad. Find the needle in the haystack. That's what the computer is doing for you. It's doing it quite well, and I'm afraid too well. So MetriGFF doesn't seem to have any major bugs occurring in this application, and it's just running since 4 years, and they're happy, and they're so happy that they don't want to invest any more effort into this. So I'm actually looking for other business partners right now. Okay, good. So much about the application. Now, like I said, the main job for today is to talk about the models. And on the next slides, I'm going to present some pretty strange / surprising things about this model. Maybe you already noticed them, maybe you didn't. Let's see. I'm going to systematize my observations in terms of what I call assumptions. Assumptions suggest that this is limiting assumption. Maybe I should have used a different word. Yes, they are limiting assumptions, but most of them are really benign. I mean, I'm observing them in models that the practitioners actually use, which obviously is because they have a practical motivation. So they limit the scope of what they consider, but it's practically motivated restrictions. You might wonder why this is assumption 3. Well, first off, you don't have to remember the numbers. I left an in for reference. Otherwise, well, there's not really good reason. Like, think about it like Star Wars. Okay, like assumptions 1 and 2 are going to come later. Now, you've probably figured out the answer to this one already, right? Like, what is the only non-static predicate here? Well, compromised, right? Because that's the only one that occurs in the action effect. Everything else is static, which means that the network graph is static and the host configurations are static. Okay. Now, my little icon here, I'm using those icons for you to better remember during this talk what those assumptions mean. So it's, closing in on the network, holding it in place. Remember, it's not only the network graph, as this icon here suggests, it's actually also the software configuration. I'm calling this a benign assumption. Why? Well, pen testing is about finding holes in the current configuration. It's not about finding things that somebody could do by exploiting things you change in your network. You want to know what is the issue right now. And the time frame of a pen test ranges from like a couple of hours to a few days, and you don't expect major changes to your network during that period. And it's an assumption everybody seems to make in this application area, so this is just something you should make. It's not really a limiting assumption. Other assumptions I'll be making are somewhat more limiting. Good. Here's another very funny assumption to make in this model. So if you saw this PDDL and say the FD benchmark collection, there is something missing that you would expect to see. Some of you have already heard this talk, so I beg the other person to try to find out what I'm talking about. So what is missing in this PDDL? Daniel, do you have an idea? The deletes, yes. You look at this effect, there's no negative effect. We're not moving a truck from A to B, right? So it is actually a delete relaxed model. So for us, this is a problem relaxation, right? For them, it's their problem. Okay. So assumption 4 is that the attacker only accumulates attack assets. It's monotonic. Now, why does this make sense? If you think what the attacker does, well, you start from nothing and then you just accumulate stuff. You accumulate access rights, maybe you know some more passwords, maybe you install some software that's going to help you. It just keeps growing. The point in time where you actually lose something typically is the point in time where it's detected and thrown out and the game is over, and that's not part of our model here. That said, it is an abstraction because some exploits might crash the target machine in some cases, so there's a risk of actually destroying something, and that's of course a delete effect. So this is an abstraction in some sense. It's a fairly harmless abstraction, not entirely harmless. In any case, that's the abstraction core security is making here. Of course, now you're thinking, why the heck do we solve this with metric of F, right? I mean, it's a complete overkill, obviously. Let me hold this discussion off until the next slide, which is even more shocking, if you can believe it. Here's the next assumption. I'm not sure how easy that question is to answer. Well, you only have to check which of those predicates in the precondition are not called compromised. The answer is all but one, right? So we have a one precondition model. Now remember, we also have only one effect, and they're both positive. So if you know your Bylander, you know that this is a very simple case. I'm sure Bylander doesn't discuss it explicitly because it's way too boring. It's actually saying that the actions are hops in the network graph. Okay, so rather than just the IP connectivity, now we're looking at the same graph, same size, small, I mean not exponentially large anyway, and the actions just say how we can hop from one machine to the next. I call this explicit network graph actions network hops. Okay, so that's an assumption they make. Now the matter of fact is if you have a single target host you want to get to, all you're really doing is finding a path in the graph of network hosts. And to find the optimal path, you can just use Dijkstra. So really the PDDL model here is just a declarative description of the edges in your network graph as defined by the software configuration and the known exploits. Now they told me that having this model is actually it's actually a value for them to have something you can actually look at and that describes at a higher level what this graph looks like. Nevertheless, if you have more target hosts, the complexity rises a bit. Nevertheless, this here is like a summary. So what they're actually using now is the PDDL model and off-the-shelf planner for a P-space complete problem applied to a Dijkstra problem. Now, why are they doing this? Well, okay. I've been asking this question myself once I noticed that this is what they're actually doing, and that was a bit late in the process. So when I developed the planner, I didn't know that this was what they're going to end up with. It is actually so, I discussed with them, this is not what they initially intended to end up with. So initially, they wanted to have richer models. Then it turned out that this model works quite well, and they kept it. Nevertheless, making the model richer is also definitely, is something they would be interested in. At least the research department is interested in. And then this kind of approach makes more sense. The other thing is you don't actually want to have just Dijkstra because optimality relative to such a crude cost function is not meaningful. What they actually want is like a selection of diverse attacks. Okay. And I did that for them by implementing A star epsilon and metric of F. Now, of course, this is not really a reason to use metric of F. Now, the biggest reason why they end up using this, and this is a point I've been making since a couple of years, but I never had such a nice forum for making it, so let me make it now. Planning people always think about their technology as it's so very powerful and expressive and super intelligent, okay? And yes, this is one reason to use it. There's another much more prosaic reason, that's it's quick and cheap, okay? So it's easier to write a model than to write a solver. And what's happened in this particular case was I was discussing this model with the research department, and then we were basically both agreeing that, well, it would be better to incorporate probabilities to make it more accurate. But then along came the development department and said, actually, my product deadline is end of next month, and I don't trust you guys to do anything useful until then, so let's just use what we have. And that's how the planner ended up with the product, and it's still there today. Okay. So, it saves time and money. It's not a bad selling point at all. Okay. So I'm assuming that you're a bit shocked by how simple the model actually is. Working on that assumption, I'm going to fill in a bit of the background where they actually came from. And that's attack graphs. Okay. So attack graphs is like the keyword of a very application-oriented security community. They were first proposed in the late 1990s, 98, I think. And there's also something called attack trees that I won't talk about. The terminology is very vague and highly overlapping, so there's no clear distinction line between those things, really. I'm going to just talk about the things that are closest, the most relevant to what we're discussing here. What's really striking about attack graphs is that they have a very planning-like view on the world. Like attacks consist of individual components and actually call those actions. They have preconditions and postconditions. There's no common terminology for those. What I wrote here is like the planning terminology. I mean, they don't use those particular words. But it's preconditions effects, essentially. The major difference of what you do in planning really is they don't want not just one plan, but an overview of what are possible, like risky, dangerous attacks. Here's an example model from some paper, from some early paper. It's really eerily like PDDL, lifted PDDL, even though they didn't even know what planning is. So if you look at the requires thing, that's the precondition. On the left-hand side, you got the object parameters. On the right-hand side, you got the actual predicates. Provides is the effect, left-hand side parameters, right-hand side effects. It is interesting to consider a little history of this research area. Like I said, it started in the late 90s. What it started out with was where the attack graph was actually the graph with nodes are the facts and the actions, and the links are like the precondition and effect relations between them. That's what they call the attack graph. So what we would call a strips action model description. Okay? The purpose was to have some abstract model of the network that the human can actually look at, and then sort of to more easily figure out what are the dangerous combinations of the attack components. The next step, of course, that all of us would expect is, well, someone comes along and says, well, actually, we can multiply those combinations automatically, and then they get a state space, and those guys are from model checking, so they use BDDs. Completely fine. I'm slightly annoyed that they also call this attack graph. So now the attack graph is overloaded as the input strips model and the state space. Okay. It gets better. 2 years later, people came along with this monotonicity abstraction. Okay. So somebody said, well, look, attacks are actually monotonic. Attackers just keep accumulating attack assets. And guess what? We can exploit this monotonicity property for more efficient analysis of the combinations of attack actions. And the next paper actually invented relaxed planning graphs. So they actually use relaxed planning graphs and relaxed plan extraction in exactly the same way I use it in FF. I was 3 years earlier, so I can say they reinvented it, but well, none of us knew about each other. So basically they invented the same thing. Annoyingly, they also called it an attack graph, so everything is an attack graph. In this paper, they actually say my attack graph is better than yours because mine is small and yours is big. I mean, without mentioning that it's actually doing a completely different thing. But anyway, those are all side remarks. The relevant thing is that there's actually a security community out there working on relaxed planning graphs. They're not the same what we do. They have different objectives, very specific application context. So, I mean, they're not duplicating our work, obviously. But obviously, well, likewise, obviously, a community bridge would be very useful. I'm kind of intending to work on this. I'm not sure yet how to best approach that. Anyway, from a modeling perspective, what I'm going to be doing is, well, so the uncertainty dimension is clear. I already talked about that. What those things tell me is that there's a second interesting dimension in those models that we don't always or usually have when we talk about sequential decision making, and that's about the complexity of the action model. And I argued that given those observations from what practical security people actually do, all of those two special cases are actually interesting and practically motivated. This is one of my major points. Okay, it is actually practical to have actions that are as simple as just specifying how to hop from one machine to the next. It is practical to assume delete relaxed actions. And of course, it is practical to make no restrictions. Now for the uncertainty. This is an assumption I haven't talked about yet, or only implicitly. But obviously it's there, right? We pretend that the attacker knows what's going on in the network, which is of course completely untrue. The very characteristic of hacking is that you don't know what the network looks like. After all, if you did, you could just, find a path like the classical planning model does. So this is an obvious issue, and it's not only me as the AI researcher seeing this issue. Core security also saw it, not the development department so much. I'm afraid they're happy with what they have. The research department is trying to convince them to actually do something like that. And I did some initial work with the research department towards this direction. Before I get to that, I'm distinguishing here like this big assumption. It's useful to distinguish it into two sub-assumptions. One is knowing the network graph topology. The other is knowing the software configurations. I make the distinctions because we could just not find any way that seemed even halfway feasible to actually make a probability distribution over all possible networks. It just didn't seem feasible. I mean, I'm very happy for Scott to prove me wrong and model it in Riddle or something. But for the moment, I'm just recommending that this is a practical assumption just for computational and modeling feasibility. What we'll be trying to relax is the second assumption, knowing the software configurations. Okay, very brief overview. This is really just for terminology. Those things here, I mean, this is the model I've already showed you. And those here are the minimal extensions of this model to MDPs and POMDPs. And I'll be mostly using those minimal extensions for illustration and because they capture like what I think of as the core of the application. I'm going to start with POMDPs because it's the most natural model. I don't need to tell you what a POMDP is. Just very briefly, we have now transition probabilities, observation probabilities, and an initial belief, a probability distribution over states. I'm going to postpone the discussion of optimization objectives, like are we maximizing a reward or what. Think stochastic shortest path for the moment. Okay. Now the basic problem is, okay, how do we model the knowledge of the attacker? And when we thought about the problem with the Core Security Research Department, Carlos Sarraute, well, the natural idea, and this is what I'm saying, POMDP was to model it as the initial belief. So what the attacker knows initially, prior to the attack about the network, is a probability distribution over the possible network configurations. I think that idea is pretty obvious, and I probably don't need to explain it. Okay. So this is what the attacker knows initially. Fine. Here's another illustration from an actual model, like this is what we implemented. We were using SARSOP, and those are our states. It's really a factored POMDP situation. You have state variables that encode what are the properties of the installed software, have you already installed an agent, and so forth. There's a terminal state that just corresponds to the attacker giving up. Of course, in the real world, nobody forces the attacker to continue, right? I mean, you can always say, okay, I got enough of this, I'm just giving up, and then you reach an absorbing state. Okay, so all of this should be fairly clear. It gets more interesting when we're talking about the actions in this POMDP. So first about the exploits. What an exploit usually does is either it gives you new access rights or whatever, or it fails, and in case it fails, it doesn't change anything for you. I mean, you know, it doesn't change the software configuration or the state of your attack, it's just a nil effect. The only effect, okay, I'm going to get to this later, this is an abstraction because, as I previously mentioned, actually the exploit might crash a machine, and then this is something we're not considering here, but this is a reasonable assumption to make. Just two effects, okay, succeed or nothing. Next assumption, and this is actually more specific to this application, more important, the actions are deterministic as a function of the software configuration. So the exploit is going to work if and only if the machine you're attacking actually has the particular software configuration you need for this exploit to work. Either it's there or it's not there. You know? And in particular, there's no point in trying the same exploit twice on the same machine because it's just going to fail again if it didn't work the first time because the machine configuration hasn't changed in the meantime. Okay. So it's a very specific class of POMDPs already, right? Even without those assumptions on the action models, it has deterministic actions. Given this, like that the action has only two possible outcomes and is deterministic, we could actually model it with exactly the same PDDL that Core Security is already using. Now this is hypothetical. There's no POMDP server out there that takes this input. I'm just saying, in principle, we could do it that way. The only thing that changes is the interpretation of the action, okay, the semantics. The semantics now is if the precondition holds, probability 1, you get what you wanted. If it doesn't hold, probability 1, you don't get what you wanted. And of course, the attacker can observe those outcomes. You get to see whether it succeeded or failed. This is all I'm really saying on this slide. But because of these very specific properties of the domain, we can use this extremely simple, I mean, think of Riddle and then look at this model to model the POMDP we're talking about. Sensing actions are also very typical of hacking. Network reconnaissance scanning actions. The POMDP model is the only one that allows us to actually include those explicitly. Here's again a hypothetical example that we more or less in this form use in our implementation. So it's a hypothetical PDDL syntax. What you can observe is that for several different versions of Windows, it actually returns the same observation. This is our model of what those things actually do. What they do is they give you a list of possible systems. So if this thing is running Windows 2000, the scanner would tell you, well, it's either 2000 or 2003. And you can model this in a POMDP simply by returning the same observation in both cases. However, still it's deterministic, right? The same assumption still holds. If the machine has the same configuration, you're going to get the same list. Okay, so both exploits and observation actions are deterministic. Now, at this point, what I was trying to do is convince you that this is pretty much a natural model, right? So if you think about POMDPs, I mean, I'm not sure if Scott agrees because it's so simple, but it seems a very natural model to me. It seems a natural model to the guy from Core Security. So it seems we're done, right? I mean, we've modeled our problem. Now there's two obvious issues. You probably see them already. They're going to be on those next slides. One is computation. I don't need to tell you it's very difficult to solve a POMDP. In our experiments with SARSOP, what happened actually is that for a realistic number of exploits, only a single machine was feasible. Like we could only solve single host networks. If you go to eBay and tell them I can pen test a single host network, they're not going to be very happy about that. Having said that, there is this sort of medicine that we use that we described in our paper. We actually used the POMDP only for single machines and then had 4 levels of hierarchies above that exploiting the particular properties of computer networks in order to decompose the problem. Some of those occur in information loss. The first one doesn't. You can actually find the bi-connected components in the network, and then the attacker has to take one particular path. And you can exploit that for simpler computation without information loss. So there is some hope. In practice, it seems to be working reasonably okay. But of course, it's a challenge. The even more tantalizing challenge, I think, is the modeling itself. So I told you how to design the model, but I didn't tell you how to get the actual probability distribution in the initial belief. I mean, how do we know what's in the head of the attacker? So at the time we did this work, we really had absolutely no answer to this. We ended up making a very simple model of software updates to approach it in some way. Chris Beck actually recently pointed out to me that there is an option that could be halfway feasible. I'm not sure if Chris is here, but I'm just acknowledging this hint. Hackers actually do use standard scanning scripts. Like the first thing you do is you run an off-the-shelf script to just, get some information about the network, do some scanning, see what's actually out there. That's what they do. Different kinds of attackers actually use different scripts. So one idea could be just use one of those scripts, and from whatever is the outcome, somehow glean your probability distribution. Now that last step, of course, is far from obvious. So it's one big research challenge how to actually do this. Okay, I'm just saying this is one approach that might work. I have no idea whether it actually will work and how it will work. Certainly there's some motivation to look for simpler models, right? And if you look for simpler models and you have a POMDP and a classical model, what do you think of? Well, an MDP. So everything is observable. We no longer have the observability thing, and we have a unique initial state rather than an initial belief. If you're worried about unique initial state, really all the state is going to be saying the attacker so far has access only to the internet. That's all the initial state is saying, and that's a very safe assumption. I mean, you just have this initial state. How are we going to do this? Well, recall here in what I'm going to say that this MDP is an MDP specifically constructed as an approximation of the POMDP. The POMDP is what we would like to solve. We can't, so we are just approximating it into an MDP. How do we do that? Well, under our assumption that the only thing we cannot observe is the software configuration. Those hash predicates, the red ones here, are the ones that are unobservable, so I just throw them out of the model. Okay, I can't have them in my MDP because I can't observe them. So what do I replace them with? Well, success probability, right? So I'm just going to replace this whole complex conditional software configuration with a number 0.3. The question then, of course, is, okay, how does this number 0.3 somehow represent the actual condition I'm trying to evaluate? Here's some kind of a derivation from the assumptions we can make to the outcome you would have expected anyway. Okay, but I think it's a nice derivation because it shows up what are the relevant properties of the application that allow us for this method to be natural. So first of all, we know the network graph. Okay, the actions are deterministic, so the outcome is determined by deterministic formula on the configuration predicates. Okay. So you can actually characterize your outcome in terms of a formula over the configuration predicates. Another benign assumption is that those are actually static. They don't change during your attack. They are always the same. So given they're always the same, why don't I just go back to the initial belief and measure whatever's going on there and take that to define my probabilities? This is an approximation and it incurs information loss. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. But say we do this, it's somewhat natural. At least it's more natural than if the formula, like the content of the formula, would actually be affected by your attack. Then this wouldn't make much sense. But it's not affected by your attack. It's static. Finally, actions either succeed or fail. So at the end of the day, all we need to do is evaluate the success probability in the initial belief, and that's exactly what core security do with their success statistics. Okay. So again, we could have come to this conclusion without this derivation. I'm just using this to show up, why it's a natural assumption to make. Now, where does this cheat? Well, very simple, really. The initial belief is only our knowledge about the network, and it's only our initial knowledge, and that might be very rough. In the POMDP, as you go along, you actually learn new things about the network, right? You observe things, you get more information, you refine your knowledge, and as an effect, you will refine your assessment of which exploits are most promising to try next. None such thing happens in the MDP. I think there might be some remedies here. For example, if exploits A and B both use similar software configurations and A didn't work, maybe you can delete some flags saying, well, B is not going to work either. But this is just a very preliminary, vague idea. I don't know if something like that can actually, I mean, you can make a hack. I'm not sure if you can actually prove to be over-approximating or under-approximating. In any case, here's a much more concrete thing. So this is our model of the exploit now. Okay. It has a success probability as 0.3. Now, as you will certainly observe, this turns the exploit into a dice throw, right? The probability of reaching the goal is being trivialized. It's like a dice throw. If I try the exploit long enough, I'm definitely going to break into the target machine, even if it doesn't actually have the software I'm trying to attack. Now, I hope you agree that this is very intuitive, and I could like to say that it's unintuitive because it contradicts some of the essential assumptions we have been making. In any case, one very simple remedy to address this MVP is to simply allow each exploit only once. Okay, so you can try the exploit once. If it didn't work, you're not allowed to apply it again, simply because if it failed once, it's going to fail again. Okay. So that's a very simple way how we keep our model from trivializing goal probability. Okay, so this brings me back to the beginning of my talk. An empty slide. More precisely, of course, this table here. Okay, so I'm repeating this to drive it deeper into your long-term memory. I can now fill in the actual content of the table. This is what it looks like. On dimension A, like the y-axis, we got uncertainty of states, POMDP, action outcomes, MDP, no uncertainty. On the x-axis, you got like those network hop actions, delete relaxed actions, fully general actions. In the top in each cell, I specify the formalism name. The red names are not names you've heard of because I've invented those here. The blue names is stuff you're all aware of, right? In the middle, I got the assumptions just for reference. I mean, you don't need to remember them now. At the bottom, I got a model if such already exists. So if we look at this cell here, this is what core security is using right now. Okay, graph distance. I mean, notice that this table spans the whole range from graph distance to factor POMDPs. So the modeling space is really very broad. This is what they are using, left bottom corner, typical of a developer department, I guess. This is what the security community has been doing all along in the attack graphs. This is what we've already seen in planning. Our current model is in this corner here because it allows detrimental side effects crashing a machine. Now, the interesting part of course, is the top left corner. I get to this in a moment. First, I need to fill in the third dimension, okay? Namely, what is the attacker actually trying to achieve, okay? For classical planning, you minimize cost. It's interesting for the probabilistic models. Now, those are a lot of the standard options that you can always apply, and I think both of them are okay. I don't have a killer argument really against this. This is a very reasonable thing you might want to try. The one point against it I have is who is going to annotate the rewards at the network. So what core security does in practice is all they ask the customers to do is point to a machine and say, I don't want the attacker to get here. If you ask customers to put numbers around the network and then those numbers are going to influence what the tool is going to say in a completely unpredictable way, I don't think that's going to fly. I mean, I don't know, maybe some special cases will, in general, I mean, it's certainly a problem, right? So it seems the goal-based MDPs are the more natural framework, just point to where the attacker shouldn't get. If you talk goal-based MDPs, of course, the first thing you think is stochastic shortest path. And indeed, the assumptions that we need for SSP are there. Okay, all actions have a non-zero cost. It's very natural. We can always give up. We can always reach an absorbing state, so we can frame it as an SSP. The only problem I see is that assigning the cost of the give-up action is very akin to assigning the reward of the target machine. So you incur a very similar modeling problem here. Which brings me to my final and favorite variant, and here really I have no but. Goal probability maximization. What you want to know is what is the likelihood that the attacker will be able to break into this machine. And I'm calling it limited budget because it could be interesting to characterize different attackers via what they are willing to spend on the attack. Am I being attacked by the NSA or am I being attacked by the classroom bully? Okay. So this is a very crude approximation, but it's certainly something useful, and it's a very simple, I mean, it's a very special case. Actually, all runs are finite. So again, it's a very special class that we can hope to solve effectively. Talking about classes we can hope to solve effectively, What's interesting about those classes is, of course, they make very strong assumptions. I mean, ridiculous assumptions if you think about it from what we usually do in this community. Like delete relaxed actions. I mean, who's trying to solve delete relaxed problems? So, at the same time, those are practically motivated. This is what security people actually do. So there's good reason to look at this and try to develop solvers that are effective for this. And I think there's actually hope to find effective factored MDP solvers for this, or factored POMDP solvers even, simply because the assumptions are so limiting. I'm only going to briefly cover those two classes here to be concise, and I'm going to start with what I call the Canadian hacker problem. My apologies to the Canadians present. I tried to think of a different name, but this one just stuck. Okay, if you can think of a different name, please tell me. Why am I calling that name? Well, you all know the Canadian traveler, right? So the lumberjack tries to get home to Quebec from the woods. My apologies to Rob. It's winter, and there's a shorter northern route, which has, however, a smaller chance of actually being open than the longer southern route. Okay, so we all know this problem. How does it relate to security? Well, if you make the strong assumptions that the actions are just network hops, you're moving in a graph. Furthermore, you assume action outcome uncertainty, MDP model, which means that what you're looking at is a graph whose edges are annotated with probabilities. Furthermore, we assume you can use each edge at most once, which is just the same as saying the graph is either there or not there with a certain probability, and now the two problems look exactly the same. They are not, however, exactly the same, because when the lumberjack moves, he changes location. You are always at exactly one location, right? When the hacker moves, it accumulates its locations. You know, it's the delete relaxed behavior. You don't lose the machines you compromised before. So what that means is, whereas the lumberjack, if the road to Quebec here happens to actually be closed, there was a small chance that it would be, and it actually is, he has to go all the way back to Edmonton and then take the northern route. Not so for the attacker. If this road here happens to be closed, you can just start from there without paying any money. You can always just take any frontier machine you've already compromised and take it from there. So the summary is we have a version of Canadian traveler where you don't need to drive back out of dead ends. And what is the interesting research here? Well, you know, you just take all those million Canadian traveler papers and adapt the algorithm to this problem, you can write a new paper. I haven't got any plans to do this, so you're cordially invited to do it yourself. The next class, attack asset MDPs, is closer to sort of what I usually do. I mean, you know, you got delete relaxed actions in an MDP framework. So let me briefly cover that. If we formulate it like formally, the model is actually exactly strips, except we replace the delete list with a success probability. The semantics is, as you would expect, the only slight trick is we have to remember which actions are still available, and we do this as part of the MDP state to preserve the Markov property. So applicability means the action has a satisfied precondition and it's still there. The semantics is exactly what you would expect. We always have to pay the price. So if we try an action, we have paid the cost for applying it. And after trying the action, no matter whether it succeeded or failed, it's no longer there. So this is the summary. What is the interesting research challenge here, or opportunity? Well, there I say the word determinization. So I agree with all probabilistic planning people present that determinization is very ugly, and because it trivializes the actual probabilistic aspect of the problem. But I mean, this model here is like the dream of a classic planning researcher, right? I mean, if I had presented this without doing all the security thing beforehand, you would have said I'm delusional, right? I'm creating the model I want to have. But look at this. I mean, each action only has two outcomes, and one of them doesn't actually do anything. So if we determinize, every probabilistic action gives you a single deterministic action, and that is actually going to be a delete relaxed action. So the classical call to the classical planner is actually a standard heuristic function. You can call LM-cut and get a very informed lower bound on expected cost. If you say that a landmark is a set of action outcomes, one of which is needed to get to the goal, then the NDP landmarks are exactly the delete relaxed deterministic action landmarks. And we have a whole zoo of methods out there to find lots and lots of those landmarks. Now you're asking me, okay, what do I do with landmarks in an MDP? Well, if I'm maximizing goal probability, what I'm saying is you can just take what Vitaly and Carmel did last year at ICAAI and do the same thing in the MDP for budget reduction. But I beg you to please not work on that because I'm already working on it. Okay, so the conclusion. I think it's a very interesting challenge to planning and sequential decision making more general, in particular also to AI more generally, perhaps at some point. It's definitely practical. I mean, some of it is already in commercial use. Parts of it have been explored by security researchers for a long time. At the same time, it's very natural an action decision problem. And that's how the applied people formulated that, even without knowing about AI. It is about choosing the actions of the attacker. It has lots of interesting modeling and algorithmic problems, as I tried to convince you. Sorry, Scott, but I think PPDDL is better than Riddle, but I'd be very happy to be convinced of the opposite if you want to try. There are some things I haven't really talked about. This here I mentioned briefly. Diverse attacks is very important. The security team doesn't want you to give them one attack. They wanted to give you, like, okay, what could the attacker do? Like, what are the different things they could do? So you need suitable notions of diversity, which is a bit underexplored in our community. There's also meta criteria. This thing is going to be running all the time in the background, so obviously we want to do something useful over time across single pen testing trials. There could be a connection to software testing here, like coverage. So that's another sort of big direction to explore. There's also a summarization issue. They don't want you to show them 100 different attacks. They want some kind of summary of what is the most critical aspects. I have no idea how to do that. Maybe somebody in this community does. And even stronger than that, what they actually want to do ideally is to tell them how to fix their network. They want a minimal change to the network with minimal loss of functionality that maximizes the security gain. Okay. Very interesting problem. If somebody wants some work on it, you're welcome to go ahead. Ultimately, really, it's an AI-complete problem. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.